Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Rachel Urgensky, and I'm on the Faculty of the Judaic Studies here at Brown. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the Arthur B. and David B. Jacobson lecture, which was established in 1986 by Arthur B. Jacobson 50 and David B. Jacobson 50 to support the study of anti-Semitism in Judaic studies. I'm extremely pleased and honored to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Elissa Bemporad. Professor Bemporad is a professor of history and Unger Chair in East European Jewish History and the Holocaust at Queen's College and CUNY Graduate Center. Professor Bemporad is a celebrated author. She is the author of Becoming Soviet Jews, The Bolshevik Experiment in Minsk, which came out in 2013 with Indiana University Press, and Legacy of Blood, Jews, Pogroms and Ritual Murder in the Land of the Soviets, 2019 by Oxford University Press. Both her books won the National Jewish Book Award, which is a very, very great accomplishment. Elissa is also the co-editor of 2 volumes, Women and Genocide, Survivors, Victims, Perpetrator, 2018, Indiana University Press, and Pogroms, a documentary history, Oxford University Press, 2021. She is completing the first volume of the Comprehensive History of Soviet Jews, forthcoming with NYU Press. She currently at work on 2 projects, the biography of Esther Frumkin, the first comprehensive studies of the DP, displaced persons camps in Italy. Her work has appeared in different languages, including French, Hebrew, Yiddish, Italian, and Russian. She is also editor of Jewish Social Studies, a very prestigious journal for Jewish studies, and series editor of Yiddish Voices for Bloomsbury Press. Her talk today, the topic of her talk today is on uses and abuses of anti-Semitism in Russia and the Soviet Union. Please join me in welcoming Professor Elissa Bemporad.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much to everyone for being here, and thank you so much to Rachel Rojansky for inviting me, and for the program in Judaic Studies for inviting me, and here to Brown. You know, it's so good to be here in person as opposed to being on Zoom. So it's very exciting. My talk today is based on the research that I've conducted for my most recent monograph, Legacy of Blood. And the goal of the talk is to explore with you the longue durée of ritual murder accusation in modern times. That is, I will be focusing on the persistence and the permutation of the blood libel, the false accusation that goes back to the Middle Ages against Jews, according to which they abduct, they torture, and they kill Christian children to use their blood for ritual purposes, primarily as a crucial ingredient used at the time of Passover. Now, in a way, the accusation of ritual murder is closely connected to the accusation of deicide, according to which, you know, Jews are collectively responsible for the killing of Christ. So, in a way, the blood libel, the ritual murder accusation, has to do with the reenactment of the killing of Christ. I will not get into the details of the origin of this accusation that, as I said, this false accusation that goes back to the Middle Ages, but for those of you who are interested, I would highly suggest that you pick up the book by a wonderful scholar, Magda Teter, who wrote the most comprehensive history of the blood libel in early modern times. What I will be doing is focusing on modern times, and again, on the permutation and the persistence in the context of Eastern Europe, specifically, or particularly Ukraine. There's a lot about Ukraine, to some degree Belarus also, during the 20th century, And I will be showing the changes of this cultural construct, which was deployed for different reasons from the interwar period through World War II, and then in the immediate post-war years. Now, before I begin, let me do two things. First of all, very quickly, I would like to offer a very brief rebuttal of statements made by historian David Engel about the use of the word anti-Semitism in historical work, which he first made in 2009 in an essay entitled Away from a Definition of Anti-Semitism, and recently revisited in this claim in a publication, the publication Zion, in which he basically argues that anti-Semitism is an arbitrary concept. It's too vague. It's too flawed a term to be used to refer to an overly broad array of historical, social, and political phenomena from different eras and from different places that aren't necessarily connected. So he takes really a stance against the leading scholarly view that says that anti-Semitism has a long history running in a nearly straight line from ancient times until today. And I agree with that we should not be imposing a teleological approach to any kind of explanation of anti-Semitism. So for instance, he says that ascribing he explains the blood libel as a fantastical imagery of Jews, and not, he doesn't connect it to anti-Semitism. So I think that we should be using the term anti-Semitism, and I think that what I will be describing today does fall under the category of anti-Semitism. As unscientific as the term might be, whenever we study a phenomenon of religious, social, economic, ethnic-based prejudice against a group that we identify as Jews, I think that we should be using the term anti-Semitism in the same way in which we should not refrain from using the term racism, right? And racism is also a term that is, to some degree, unscientific, so to speak. So I think we can do it. We can use the term anti-Semitism as long as we root the events described by the word deeply into the historical, cultural, socioeconomic context that gave rise to the event described. And this is hopefully what I will be doing tonight. And I will really try to elucidate the term I am using by rooting it in the context. Second, before I begin, I want to visually introduce the topic of persistence and permutation of the blood libel, and then make an observation. So to visually introduce it, to visually introduce the topic, I want to show you this painting. This is a painting about ritual murder that captures one of the modern permutations undergone by the accusations script, which, as I said, is rooted in the accusation of Jewish deicide, the myth according to which Jews are collectively responsible for killing Christ. And here you see a modern script of this accusation. It's no longer a child who's being tortured and murdered, but it is a young woman. This painting, by the way, is 5 by 8 meters. It is a humongous painting that was commissioned by a Russian aristocrat in 1898 to the well-known Hungarian painter Mihály Munkácsy in the wake of the Tisza-Eszler affair, which was a blood libel that took place in Austria-Hungary in 1882-1883, following the disappearance and murder of a young woman, and a group of Jews is accused of having ritually murdered her. There's a lengthy trial that follows, and which eventually results in the acquittal of all the accused, and some anti-Jewish violence ensued. Anyway, this This painting was publicly shown in St. Petersburg in 1914 on the eve of World War I, and eventually the aristocratic family fled Russia during the war before the Bolsheviks come to power, and they bring this painting with them, and it was discovered in London. Anyway, what I'm interested in here is the young woman who seems to symbolize the Slavic people, or perhaps this new idea of nation. She embodies this new idea of nation, the ideas of nation that come under threat because of ethnic tensions, economic crisis, as well as political turmoil that was unleashed by the assassination of the Tsar in 1881. And so the anxieties over the survival of the nation materialize through the ritual murder of a young woman. And you see here this detail of these Jewish vampires who carry out the ritual by drawing the young woman's blood with a number of sharp instruments, including their teeth. And you see how the blood libel narrative is further modernized in a way by the addition of an obviously sexual subtext, right? The naked prey is not only murdered through torture and the drawing out of the blood, she also appears to be the potential victim of rape, as ritual murder becomes sexual murder. Okay. So now the observation, which is necessary in order to appreciate the question of change that the accusation undergoes. And I'm interested here in a geographic area of Europe that undergoes momentous changes in the midst of World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the establishment of the Soviet Union, and the creation of an entirely new political system compared to the political system that came before it. So, with few exceptions, under the Soviet regime, and I'm showing you here the area where most Jews lived, it's called the Pale of Settlement, where Jews lived before the establishment of the Soviet Union. Anyway, with few exceptions, under the Soviet regime, the blood libel did not unleash anti-Jewish violence. Under the Tsar, you have a blood libel accusation, and then usually you have a pogrom. You have an instance of anti-Jewish violence. So the blood libel sparks anti-Jewish violence. Under the Soviets during the 1920s and 1930s, you don't have public attacks and displays of violence against Jews. These are officially not tolerated by Soviet authorities. And this attitude on the part of the Soviet states really grows out of the Soviet condemnation of anti-Semitism, grows out of the campaigns against anti-Semitism that are launched as early as 1918, primarily as a way to break away from the Tsar's legacy of anti-Semitism by Lenin, and are celebrated, at least on paper, until World War II. Now, in this context, the Bolshevik state really deals or tries to deal a blow to the blood libel tradition, tries to root out its cultural acceptability by confronting very aggressively the legacy of the Beilis affair. Here I'm showing you Menachem Mendel Beilis, who was arrested in Kiev in 1911. The Beilis affair, which goes from 1911 till 1913, is the most spectacular, in a way, blood libel in modern Europe. There's a trial that was the result of the intervention of high echelons of the Russian government with the support of the Ministry of Justice and the tacit approval of Nicholas II, and it was fueled by the reactionary elements in Russian society. And here, as I said, Mendel Beilis is arrested. He's accused of having killed Andrei Yushchinsky, who's a young Ukrainian boy, for ritual purposes. And eventually he's acquitted at the end of the trial in 1913, but the verdict is very dubious and really left room for a lot of disbelief. So in an event of great symbolic significance, Soviet authorities publicly tried and executed the major figures involved in the Beilis trial, including the chief prosecutor. So here are the transcripts of the 1922 trial against the chief prosecutor, Oskar Wipper, who eventually dies after this trial. And you know, if you read the transcript, it's very interesting how the Bolsheviks are really trying to make sure, they're trying to understand the extent to which he believes that Jews carry out the ritual murder at least once a year. Vera Chibiriak was a notorious criminal in Kiev and probably was responsible for the boy's murder. She's arrested and she's shot by the Bolsheviks in downtown Kiev shortly after the end of the Civil War. So this is really publicly condemning, rejecting the blood libel as a manifestation of anti-Semitism for political purposes primarily. The goal is to present the new system as the antithesis of the Tsarist regime, which had allowed for the Beilis trial when an innocent man was put on trial without any evidence. So this rupture, I think, is captured very clearly in these two quotes. One is by a conservative Russian thinker from 1904, and one is by Lenin in 1918. Now, despite these early attempts to root out the memory and the legacy of the Beilis affair, ritual murder accusations did not wane in Soviet society. In the interwar period, in fact, there were numerous cases of ritual murder accusations followed by criminal investigations, including in places like Moscow, Minsk, Makhachkala, Kanyev, Tula, Poltava, and other places. Here I've pinpointed in blue some of, it's not very scientific. I was criticizing the term anti-Semitism, but my way of pinpointing cities on the map is not very scientific. Anyway, it gives you a sense of some of the places. This is Ukraine, and this is Belarus. So these accusations involved actually investigative commissions, medical experts, local and central authorities, reports in the press, accounts by the secret police. And in most instances, what is interesting is that the memory of the Beilis affair lingered as evidence of an innate Jewish behavior to perpetrate these crimes. Although Beilis had been acquitted, it remained the precedent, at least for the people, so to speak. If for the Bolshevik state, the Beilis case remained the symbol of a corrupt system, the Tsarist system, that unjustly took to trial a Jewish man wrongly accused, written and oral references to Beilis echoed throughout the instances of blood libel in the Soviet Union, and they validated ritual murder. Okay, there are several factors that help us explain the endurance and the permutation of the ritual murder accusation in the Soviet landscape of the interwar period. I want to dwell on two of them. How do we explain that this is still there, this ritual murder accusation, although the Soviets are combating anti-Semitism? First of all, there is a connection between the occurrence of the blood libel and the nature of the Bolshevik experiment itself. The deployment of the blood libel in an atheistic, modern, secular society, at least in theory, based on the myth of the brotherhood of peoples, becomes an indicator of the limits of the Soviet attempt to modernize and secularize society by force and intense speed. Of course, ritual murder accusations grew out of the pervasiveness of slander, denunciatory frenzy, paranoia, which were common emotions and modes of expression in Soviet society, connected to the ongoing search for enemies, real or mostly imagined, who posed a threat to the system. But the accusation also resulted from the encounter between Jews and peasant culture in the context of a system that promoted urbanization and produced new socioeconomic structures that disrupted the pre-existing ones. The villagization of urban settings facilitated a new mentality of insularity in which traditionalism, folklore, ethnic and religious identity could find a strong niche despite official Soviet ideology. Peasants resist, in some cases, Sovietization by resorting to the accusation of blood libel, to voice their resistance to the new system, which in their eyes was dominated by Jews. Rather than openly criticize the Soviet state, some would resort to the more traditional and familiar accusation of ritual murder. The blood libel accusation could serve as a passive form of resistance to the Soviet system, as a way to, in a way, reforge a safe community that excluded Jews. It became a channel through which recently urbanized peasants could vent their ethnic and class resentments, their mistrust over the unknown, their anxiety and fear about new life conditions in the city, where for many the rise of the Jew, her relative socioeconomic and political success and enhanced visibility, the brutality of the new system, and the apprehension over the end of established familiar patterns of life intertwined and coalesced. Two examples very quickly, or one and a half. In May 1926, in the area of Chernitsky, of the Chernitsky village, which is in the Vitebsk region of Belarus, here the new economic and geographic displacement caused by Soviet policies triggered the emotional response of the blood allegation against Jews. Specifically, the Jewish settlement on land, which was promoted by the state during the 1920s and the 1930s to modernize the Jews, because the Jews had been, merchants, peddlers, so we have to modernize them socioeconomically, so we're going to resettle them on land. This elicits the complaints and even the rage of local peasants. In this case, they attempt to force the Jewish settlers to leave the land. And in 1926, in this instance, in May 1926, the village council's chairman and dozens of peasants from surrounding villages approached the Jewish settlement in Zachernia and demand that the Jews give back the body of a young woman who had recently gone missing. Jews had likely, so we are told in the sources, they were likely kidnapped and killed the young woman. When the accused denied the charges, the peasants attempted to break into the settlement and search for the land for their woman, as they refer, our woman, their woman's body. The police eventually stopped them. Of course, this goes against the campaign against anti-Semitism. And of course, the fact that the police prevented them reinforced their suspicion of Jewish power. And there's another case that takes place in Dubosari, which is in Kherson province of Ukraine, where, there is an ongoing war right now, a genocidal war. And there were rumors about a Jew who allegedly abducted a woman and killed her by inserting nails through her body, stirred up the residents in the nearby villages. And again, there is ethnic tension. There almost is violence. And then the chief of police intervenes and releases or helps the Jews face the peasants. And the chief of police happened to be Jewish. And of course, this also reinforced the suspicion of the fact that the authorities, Soviet authorities, were protecting Jews who might have been carrying out ritual murder. So this is one factor. The second factor that helps us explain why, the persistence of this accusation in the Soviet context has to do with the intensity of the anti-religious propaganda promoted by the state, which inadvertently played a role in maintaining this powerful anti-Jewish myth. Most notably, the anti-religious propaganda that demonized Judaism, and particularly Jewish rituals of blood, circumcision, and kosher slaughtering. And I'm showing you here some examples, images from the Soviet press and the Museum of Atheism. So this anti-religious propaganda, which, by the way, in parenthesis, Judaism was not singled out in any way. Christianity, if there was one religion that was singled out, that was Christianity. But we have to think about the readers who are reading, or the audience of these texts, and those who saw these images. Here's from the museum in Leningrad. Those who saw these images inadvertently reinforced anti-Jewish stereotypes. So Sovietization produced an unintended link between anti-Judaism campaigns and grassroots popular anti-Semitism. After all, never before in these territories had Judaism been publicly demonized by the state. And this demonization revived the pre-existing culture that identified the Jews as a threatening other, which could be, this sense of the existence of a threatening other could be deployed to make sense of, the socioeconomic crisis, political anxiety, social change, and so on. Finally, the recurrence and transformation of ritual murder is also a way to measure social change and echoes the process of Jewish women's empowerment in Soviet society. So gender is very interesting here. Sarah is being accused of having carried out ritual murder. Well, the change in the victim's gender identity had become widespread in other European societies in Eastern Europe, and I showed you, the painting. As the alleged Jewish murders targeted non-Jewish women instead of children, right? We've seen that already. In Soviet society, Jewish women became perpetrators of ritual murder. Women are entirely absent from the traditional ritual murder script. At most, they help, like in the painting. We can go back to the painting later with, bringing the instruments of torture, but they don't carry out. They're not the perpetrators. It's very gendered, like racism is gendered. Anti-Semitism is also generally very gendered. But here you have a variation in the blood libel narrative that grows out of the successful social mobility and professionalization of Jewish women in Soviet society, which was extraordinary compared to that of Ukrainian women or Belarusian women. So in a way, through this accusation, they are punished, Jewish women, for their empowerment. They become female predators. And here, I showed you Sarah. I just wanted to say very quickly before I move on to the war period that I want to remind us, yes, that there were criminal investigations that followed the accusations. So you have police that intervenes, local authorities, sometimes central authorities. So, in some cases, the police or local authorities might even think that maybe it is true that Jews carry out this ritual, but then they, there is the law that intervenes. There is, or central authorities intervene and say, no, this is absolutely not. This is, we were fighting anti-Semitism. But what is interesting is that those who make these accusations are usually arrested. So in these three cases that I'm showing you here, those who made the accusations are put on trial and they are arrested. They spend some time in prison, something that does not take place in other parts of Eastern Europe at the time. Even in Poland, interwar Poland, we have some instances in which the blood libel, the accusation is made, and the Jews are arrested, at least temporarily. So it is plausible that Jews did carry out this crime. In the Soviet Union, we do not have, and so these people were all arrested. Okay, what happens to the ritual murder accusation during World War II? As you know, this is a war that drastically swayed the habits and the rhetoric of violence in the German-occupied territories of the Soviet Union. We have a total ethnic war unleashed in June 1941, in which approximately 1.5 million Jews are killed, most of them in mass shooting operations carried out by the Einsatzgruppen. So what we see is a revived anti-Bolshevik sentiment in certain areas that quickly comes to intersect with wartime propaganda, anti-Jewish propaganda, and sometimes even with the blood libel. And anti-Jewish propaganda from World War II often featured this ritual murder subtext. The blood libel trope drew new inspiration from the myth of Judeo-Bolshevism, namely the idea that Soviet communism was really part of a wider Jewish scheme to seize power, a Jewish plot to rule the world. So I'm just showing you here, this is a drawing made in November 1941. Actually, the worker is a worker from the Azovstal factory, which I am sure that most of you know about the Azovstal in Mariupol, right? Which was established in the early 1920s in Mariupol. And so here you have a worker. We don't know the ethnicity. He might be Russian, he might be Ukrainian, but he's depicting Stalin holding a knife in his hand and surrounded by hundreds of skulls. This is obviously amateur art, but it was seemingly built on the well-known anti-Bolshevik depictions from the Civil War period that I assume that some of you are intimately familiar with, that portray Leon Trotsky, who, although he did not identify as a Jew, he was Jewish. Anyway, here you also see the skulls, and here you see the skulls. This is from the Polish-Soviet War, and here this is a more a rare poster that I found in the archives. Also, you see the skulls in the corner, and this is just the text of of the drawing translated for you, and this is not in any way an iconographic representation of ritual murder, but it does capture the ways in which during World War II, Jews came to be seen more than earlier as the prime actors of a modern version of ritual murder, this time carried out in the name of communism. Now, at times, Nazi propaganda explicitly encouraged the exploitation of the blood libel theme in conjunction with the Judeo-Bolshevik myth. Ritual murder and communism both embodied the Jewish spirit and lust for power. In the spring of 1942, for example, the Germans executed all the Jews in the small town of Medvin in the Kyiv province, accusing them of murdering for ritual purposes, a Red Army soldier. And when the body of the POW was discovered, the Germans spread the blood libel rumor. They staged the trial. They sentenced the Jews to death. They tortured them before they murdered them. But although there was no immediate reason for the Germans to exploit ritual murder to justify their extermination policy, they still chose to do so. This book that some of you might be familiar with, 1943, The Jewish Ritual Murder, which was published and distributed throughout German-occupied Soviet territories to high, officers in the Wehrmacht. And these are the words of the Nazi Party member Helmut Schramm, who, who wrote this introduction, I guess, to promote anti-Bolshevik and anti-Jewish propaganda. And here you also have, several examples in, I've looked at some of the Ukrainian language newspapers published under German occupation that also give us examples of how the blood libel theme was exploited during the war. So this is from the August 1943 issue of a Kyiv published newspaper that featured a detailed analysis of the murder of Tsar Nicholas II and his family. This was published on the 25th anniversary of the massacre of Yekaterinburg and was entitled The Jew's Right Hand. And again, it presents the assassination of the Tsar's family as a ritual murder carried out by Jewish Bolsheviks. I won't get into, the details of how the order, that was given to execute the Romanov family that came directly from Lenin, but the telegram from Moscow with the directive was indeed signed by Sverdlov, who was Jewish, and in 1918 chairman of the Central Executive Committee of the Congress of Soviets. But I also want to remind us that this, the idea, the interpretation of the murder of the Romanov family as a ritual murder was relatively well spread in Poland in the interwar period. And especially among, more conservative circles. And you also have the well-known British journalist Robert Wilton, who was a Times correspondent in St. Petersburg and worked for the European office of the New York Herald, who wrote in 1920 in his account of the last days of the Romanovs that their death had indeed been an act of Jewish ritual murder. Now, what is interesting, moving away geographically from the former Pale of Settlement, what we see is that ritual murder accusation turned up even in those regions, such as Central Asia, that did not come under direct German military occupation and were thus removed from wartime propaganda. But because of the momentous population movements that take place, there are still rumors about, events, propaganda, and events that take place in the European regions of the Soviet Union. So you have many refugees, including both Soviet citizens, Jews and non-Jews alike, and Polish Jews who flee to Central Asia. And in the summer of 1942, there's a group of Jewish women, wives of Red Army military personnel who were fighting at the front, who write a letter to Stalin and the Central Committee of the Communist Party, and they complain about anti-Semitism in the midst of the war in the cities of Tokmak and Frunze, and this is what they write. That, Jews are killing children of other nations, drinking their blood, and using their body parts to make soup. Now, of course, the context here, you have wartime food shortages, you have rumors about cannibalism on the Eastern Front, hearsay, rumors of blood libel allegations that, refugees could have brought with them to Central Asia. All this played into the events, into this context. What is interesting is that these were well removed from the more traditional say, Passover plot, which involved, again, the abduction of Christian children, the use of their blood, or even of young women, the use of their blood for religious purposes, right? But the investigation conducted by party authorities in Tokmak and Frunze and the ensuing Soviet secret police report confirmed the Jewish women's grievance, confirmed the fact that Jews were being accused of using body parts to make soup, but there is no reference to any kind of religious, any kind of ritual, specific ritual that Jews would be engaging in. So you have, in a way, the secularization. We can talk about the secularization of the blood libel as the food containing human flesh and blood replaces the unleavened bread the Jews eat during Passover, the matzah, in a murder that was no longer necessarily ritual in nature, but it was merely, in a way, predatory cannibalism. So there's no reference to religious rituals, and perhaps this is not even that surprising, since Soviet Jews were, by 1942, most of them no longer religious because of the campaigns against religion carried out systematically by the Soviets. And the idea that they use blood for ritual, for religious ritual, was less plausible. I know this is all very maybe depressing, but we're approaching the end of this longue durée of ritual murder. So I would like now to dwell on one case study that allows us, in a way, to really zoom into the impact of the war on the permutation of the blood libel narrative. And we are in the summer of 1945 in the beautiful city of Lviv, which used to be Western Poland and was liberated from the Germans and incorporated by the Soviets into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And it became the arena of a ritual murder accusation against the Jews. And according to the allegations, local Jews had kidnapped Polish and Ukrainian children, murdered them, and hidden their corpses within the confines of the local synagogue, which you see here. And, there was a crowd of hundreds of people who gathered in the marketplace, the Krakowski marketplace, which was near the synagogue on Buhilna Street. This is the photograph from actually before the war, and this is the synagogue today. And there is, a lot of commotion, emotions, even some physical attack against Jews, statements. Here you see some of the statements, disappointment that Hitler had not come to Lviv some 20 years earlier, which would have prevented Jews from killing children. Some people voiced their rage over the traces of blood of the allegedly murdered children in the synagogue courtyard. Others cried that Jews stole children, slaughtered them, and then used, again, their bodies for, they sold the bodies or parts of the bodies at the marketplace. The city police, the Soviet authorities actually intervened very quickly, and the accusation does not spiral into pogrom, something that does happen in areas of Poland that are not under Soviet control, and I can address that question later. And what is interesting here is two things. First of all, there is blood. Well, this is from the investigation of the public prosecutors from the prosecutor's office of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. These are documents from the Dalo archive that we talked about earlier. And so there is an investigation. Everyone makes sure that there are no body parts anywhere to be found. But what is interesting is that there was some blood that was found or that was seen in this small courtyard. and that was the blood from kosher slaughtering, from the killing of chicken. So here you have Polish Jewish refugees who have returned to the city that has undergone the inhabitants of the city, extraordinary violence and ethnic cleansing, right? The Soviets are really engineering ethnic cleansing, moving Ukrainians in and pushing Poles out. And the Jews are, in a way, caught in the middle. Here, but because they're more religious, there is a reference to the fact that this blood, might have been the blood of, besides children, it might also have been the blood of those Jews who still followed the laws of still ate kosher meat. And these were Polish Jews. What happens is that those who incited the violence, those who started with the rumors, are arrested, and especially one individual who's a Ukrainian, ethnically is a Ukrainian, and he's arrested, and there is reference in the sources to the fact not only because he made the accusation of ritual murder, but also because he collaborated with the Germans during the occupation. What is interesting is that this is 1945. In 1946, he is released from prison, and this is very interesting because it sheds light on the significant change that takes place in the Soviet politics about anti-Semitism. In the post-war period, they changed their mind. Soviet authorities changed their mind, and they are no longer concerned with this question of anti-Semitism, and they're not that concerned with the question of collaboration either. So they revised their approach to the blood libel, to this, crime. And this is a strong sign of the times, the fact that they show little interest in the subject, both of Nazi collaboration, anti-Semitism, and stomping out ritual murder. Something that we see also in echoes from below that we have at the time of the doctor's plot of 1953, the alleged conspiracy of Soviet doctors, almost all of whom happened to be Jewish, to murder government and party officials of 1943. Here I'm just showing you some quotes from Moscow and Vilnius, meaning the interpretation from below. Stalin did not orchestrate this as a ritual murder, of course, but from below, the response from below, how people read it from below is through the script of ritual murder, again, a secularized form of ritual murder. And this is also, echoes, and I was able to find some in memoirs, echoes of the doctor's plot in the Gulag near Kazan. And so here you have the age-old image of Jew murder that is fused with the Soviet image of political traitor. But regardless, whether it was secular or religious in essence, the way in which people read it from below, for many Jews and also non-Jews alike, the doctor's plot was a blood libel. And a contemporary put it, it was the Bailey's affair of the atomic age. Okay, so now, in conclusion, yes. I'm doing good with time because I'm concluding, so it's good. Again, this goes back to comments I made in the beginning, but we tend to associate the blood libel with something very ancient, right, with the Middle Ages. So how is it possible that this false accusation persisted for so long and actually had rather original permutations, as I have shown you. It underwent changes over time and specific contexts. And I want to finish with, referring to the words of historian Jonathan Frankel, who, reminded us that this is not the right question to ask. Why? Why is this false accusation? Why does it persist for so long? And he criticized the conventional wisdom among historians to focus on the gradual marginalization of the ritual murder charge over the span of hundreds of years as essentially flawed. Instead, Frankel affirmed the importance of seeing the extraordinary vitality of this false myth in modern as well as in contemporary history. He argued in favor of investigating ritual murder in the context of the modern Jewish experience as a byproduct of modernization, as the outgrowth of the dark side of modern times. And if the irrational is an essential ingredient of modernization, as Frankel argued, then the blood libel could surely become a factor in the hyper-rational modern atheistic societies that the Nazis and the Bolsheviks strove to create. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elissa. So we'll open it for questions. You need me for the questions.
You really don't need you for the questions,
Okay.
Unless you want to stay next to me.
No, I want, but it's not now.
So thank you so much for the talk. There's a lot to work with there. I had one quick question and then one sort of like theoretical kind of question for you. So the first question was, in the account of the execution of the Romanovs, there was a reference to like Kabbalistic symbols that were discovered. Is that like, I know that's often code for, sort of a way to sort of characterize something that would seem ritually Jewish, but was there any more description of what that meant? I just was curious, like, what do they mean by a Kabbalistic symbol? And I have a follow-up question. I'm just curious on that.
I'm not sure what they meant exactly. I've seen one other reference to this, but I think it's more to engage the readership and provide some details of some references to something concrete that might have been there. But I haven't,
Well, it's interesting because I think, so that it does relate to the more theoretical question, which is that, there's a way in which you kind of gave us a really important window into the collision between religion and I think a more racialized figure of the Jew, especially the original portrait you showed, and this sort of like characterization, especially of like Hasidic Jews, like the Jew who's focused right in the middle with the beard and the shrine, like you have this sense of like there's a kind of encoding of religion and race at the same time. And the way that then plays out, interesting in all the examples you gave, including even the more hyper modern ones of like the doctor who gives the unseen injection, there's some kind of conspiratorial dimension that's being kind of elicited. So I think like I'm curious, like when you think of, this is the question, when you think of describing the role of the ritual murder and the way you concluded, which I thought was so effective, of saying like even in a hypermodern society, there's something about a seemingly ancient and evil, however you want to encode it, like maybe it's precisely because there's something about the conspiratorial, like that kind of spectral dimension of like, there's something about the Jews, right? And you broke down, I thought, clearly how, a kind of traditional Marxist class analysis of anti-Semitism just doesn't work in the early Soviet Union, because the figure of the Jew can be Bolshevik, it can be capitalist, it could be Nazi, it could be, whatever you want, and just take your pick and project. And then you kind of trace how that seems to be really kind of what's going on in the modern period. So I don't know, I guess the question is like, when you use the term ritual murder and you're using it deliberately in this context, like, is there something that you found that feels like it's the mystery of the Jew that precisely is what makes it so enduring as a kind of figural other?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good question, and my next project is really moving away from this
I think I've dealt sufficiently with the question of violence, and this is nothing compared to my work on the pogroms. But well, first of all, the question of a sect, right? Almost a mysterious sect. In the transcript of the acquittal of Menachem Beilis, who's acquitted, it says, this is why it's so it can be read both ways. It says maybe he wasn't to blame, but a sect. This is clearly the work of a sect. And we actually do have this also. There's another trial. This is what Dostoevsky also refers to in the writer's diary, where a little girl is murdered and Jews are accused, and there is this reference to a sect. But what you ask about the kind of the theoretical approach to the study of ritual murder, I mean, I did not develop this in the writing I've done about this topic, but I should have. Others have. I think that David Nirenberg does it in his work on anti-Judaism. It is a conspiracy. It really is a conspiracy, and I see it very closely connected to the conspiracy of Christ killers and the conspiracy of Judeo-Bolshevism, and I think that this the possibility of taking the Jews and the Jews and linking them to the existence of this conspiracy, and the protocols of the Elders of Zion, of course, is the most important text in the history of anti-Semitism, I think, because it really shows us what, although it doesn't refer really to go back to your question about religion and race, there isn't much, although these are religious Jews that are meeting on the site of the cemetery, but it's not developed there enough. But the question of conspiracy, I think, is very important. And this is why the blood libel could be tied in with Judeo-Bolshevism, right? Yeah. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for a wonderful talk, very, very rich. I've got two thoughts. First of all, the connection between the blood libel and violence. In her work on the medieval blood libel, Miri Rubin argues that by deploying the blood libel, by imputing violence on the Jews, it is a way of justifying violence against the Jews. So it has a role in creating violence, and it's very useful in those moments where violence leads to be, and that was very clear in what you said. In terms of the question of modernity, it seems to me that it's working in two ways. There's the top-down anti-Semitism that you were talking about a lot, but there's also the bottom-up anti-Semitism, which is the conspiracy, it's a deeper truth than anything else, that the Jews are murderers. And so it isn't disprovable, it's a conspiracy theory. You can't disprove whatever you say. The Pope came out against it, the government came out against it, science comes out against it, it's not provable. And in terms of modernity, it seems to show that attempts to make society modern can use that, but in fact, that exists without them. And there's a very strong continuity of the past into modernity, which modernity actually can't deal with.
No, that's and I see that in the material that I work with, and there's no way of there's no way of, it's almost unstoppable, but it serves a purpose. It is specifically in modernity. It serves a very important purpose, I think. I mean, for me, it was very surprising the Lviv case, which I studied, at length, because I found a lot of documents in the archives. It's very interesting how, historically, Ukrainians and Poles, there's a lot of tension, especially in the city of Lviv. But here they come together, and although, in terms of religion, yes, Uniates and Catholics, they come together, despite the difference, despite the religious difference and the ethnic tension, but they come together because there's a common enemy, which is, again, this a religious Jew who's also racialized through the presence of the Bolsheviks, who are now in our city and are moving us around, right, forcing us out, and so it brings them together in this kind of almost a community, right? And the blood libel serves this purpose.
I guess following up on that, if there were no Jews, would they have to invent Jews? Is there somebody else to fill that function?
It's hard to apply that question to to this geographic area where there were many Jews. In Italy, however, so I can turn around. In Italy, there are very few Jews, and yet, Jews can at times serve that purpose. That's exactly what I think David Nierenberg also writes about that, right? So, because they serve a specific purpose in, I think, more modern society than in pre-modern society. So yes, the answer is yes. I guess that would also apply to Ukraine, and actually in some, but I was going to say in some areas where Jews were murdered and were no longer there, you still have. I found 2 instances of blood libel, but there are no Jews there, but there is a memory of their presence, so that it doesn't doesn't necessarily apply to it.
Thank you. This was incredibly enlightening and helpful. I had a question about periodization that you work with. I'm taking my mask off.
Sorry, yeah. Or I can come closer.
No, the periodization, as I understood it, there's sort of I think Adam put a bottom-up conspiratorial anti-Semitism that sort of lingers from the late imperial period and through the Soviet period of the Soviet state, despite its ambivalent attitudes, doesn't really put an end to. But I think it's significant that they don't lead to the same sort of violence that they do in the earlier period. And I think it's significant that when the state comes in, they do these investigations and they discover that. So I took it to be that there's sort of one might think of Soviet official anti-Semitism, which is anti-religion and therefore anti-Judaism fits within that broader context. And then there's popular anti-Semitism. But the official Soviet state, of course, is not endorsing that sort of popular conspiratorial anti-Semitism. And from the timeline you present, and I think intuitively it makes a lot of sense to me, the war changes that on both fronts. It elicits more and broader popular anti-Semitism, and it begins to change the Soviet state's attitude so that by the post-war period, with the Doctors' Plot, and even before, I would suggest, the anti-cosmopolitan campaign, that the Soviet state is now playing its own part in spreading and not simply eradicating these kinds of things. So that timeline makes sense to me. What I'm a little bit curious about is the timeline of the 20s and 30s. And I know, like, there's the Yiddish theater, there's all sorts of support, but it seems to me if we're going to look at popular anti-Semitism, I'm sort of surprised that the Holodomor, the collectivization, the incredible decolonization, that those ruptures of the late 20s and early 30s didn't spike the conspiratorial side of Jewish rituals. And do you think in the archives you just didn't happen to find those, or I guess I would imagine that peak coming earlier than that, particularly in those areas of the Pale, even before the Nazi occupation, that were deeply ambivalent about the Soviet state and the things that it felt that the Judeo-Bolshevik state was doing to Ukrainians.
Okay, so you're absolutely right that, I would say that, it's a kind of a traditional, in terms of periodization approach, meaning that, in the interwar period, there's a tension between, we could say, popular anti-Semitism from below and the state that is trying to tame it. Is in many instances, local authorities might buy the accusation, but then central authorities, when they're called, in one case in 1927, Kharkiv is the main city in Ukraine, and the main authorities are brought to this place where there's a ritual murder accusation, and they intervene and they fire the whole police department. So with the war, and on the eve of the war, as we know from the memoirs of Vasily Grossman also and others, there is a beginning of, it's not that important, anti-Semitism, it's not, we are in the war. That case in Kyrgyzstan from 1942, I doubt that there was anything that was done. The letter was sent to Stalin, there was an investigation, I'm sure that no one was, it's 1942, and there's another case, 1943, in Tashkent, ritual murder, and nothing is done, So, the priority is now the war, and so you begin to have a synergy between popular anti-Semitism and official anti-Semitism, the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. Your question about collectivization, depolitization, you're right that I haven't, most of the cases that I have are from, beginning in 1922, I have one in 1928, and then I have in 1936, 1937, right? But it doesn't mean that it's not there, So, I did research, mostly in Ukraine, but it was Kyiv and Lviv. And I found evidence in the press, but there had to be. But maybe even in that case, it was put aside because we're now dealing with the depolitization. So officially, yes, we fight against anti-Semitism, but it's not a priority. I was actually surprised to see at the time of the Great Purges, in Minsk in 1937, there was a trial, a public trial in 1937 at the height of the purges, and these two Belarusians are arrested for 2 years, 2.5 years, only for having said that Jews, carry out this ritual once a year. So I don't have an answer. I'm sure that there's more work that can be done if one is interested, and so that it's a good question. 1932, 1933. You ready to go? Oh, right.
Okay.
Oh, there's a question here.
Oh, okay.
Thank you so much for coming. And I don't know, when I was taught to write an English essay, the big thing was kind of the silhouette statement. And I guess you're connecting kind of this chain of anti-Semitism, geographically through history, and kind of bringing it through secularism and modernity. Do you find it instructive for how you might kind of, as a nation, as a society, as current Jewish people, deal with the anti-Semitism that is happening today? Are there lessons that we can learn from these different history?
Well, the lesson, what I have found interesting is that, when the Jews got, in the interwar period, and even in, early years of the war, when they were able to get the attention from, the state, from the central authorities abided by the law, which was we are against anti-Semitism. Once the state, turned their, rejected that and was no longer interested, and thought that this was not relevant, we have other priorities, then, there was no solution, right? And no one was held accountable. So I guess the lesson to be learned is that, I think that politicians and I don't want to say the state because that sounds too, but politics matters, right? And it's no surprise that we have so much about conspiracies today after 2016. It makes sense that it's the can of worms is open, right? The Pandora box is open. So I think that responsible politicians, and I'm not saying that the Soviets were necessarily responsible, but they, there was a commitment, at least on paper, to fight, this kind of prejudice, fight against anti-Jewish prejudice, and so, I think that politicians have a responsibility to have a clear idea of what prejudice is and how to fight against prejudice. Because it's very clear how in the interwar period Soviet Jews felt empowered. They know that the state is on their side, and they know that if they can get the attention of the authorities, those who make the accusation will be held accountable. But after the war, they were powerless because the state ignores them entirely. Because anti-Semitic prejudice is not limited. So I don't know if I have answered your question. I mean, my personal answer to that question is alliances, to create as many alliances as possible. So alliances with other minority groups and fighting anti-Semitism together with fighting racism and other prejudice. So forging alliances, I think, is very important. Forging alliances in Soviet society was not really possible, despite the rhetoric of other people. So I don't know if I answered the question.
Okay, so thank you, Elissa, for a wonderful